Kind of caught me. I'm pretty sure gummy bears and booze is why my love handles have grown during quarantine, even though I'm working out 6 days a week. You gonna finish that?
Yeah, I can finish this.
Week 4, quarantine dads. We're still inside.
Still inside.
It's not snowing, but it was cold today.
It was cold
and
today.
I'm sad and low energy. I'm Andy.
I'm tired, and I'm Micah.
2 dads, drinking bourbon, whiskey, chatting with each other,
Yeah.
fighting
Having
away
lots
the
of
end times.
Fighting away the end times.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm tired, but I know you are too. Been a long weekend, been a long previous week, but it was good. To get out and play with the kids, have some outdoor time for a little bit.
Yesterday was a nice day.
Yeah, it was a nice day.
How Minnesotan of us to start by talking about the weather 2 weeks in a row.
Yeah, I know. I was actually joking with one of my friends about he's like, can you adopt me? I can, but it's going to be a severe climate change from what you're used to, because he's from California. And then, you're probably going to have to deal with the fact that we've been socially distancing since before the Louisiana Territory purchase.
He wouldn't have to worry about breaking away and floating into the Pacific, though, so there's trade-offs.
There are trade-offs. We don't have earthquakes yet. I mean, I don't know how much like North and South Dakota's fracking is going to help us with that. But
you got to learn to drive with the fear.
Drive with the fear.
Talladega Nights taught me anything.
Yeah, I mean, if you're if you're used to driving around town with a cougar sitting next to you, and I'm like, we're in our mid-late 30s. Our wives are technically cougars now, right?
Oh, wow. Thank God they don't listen to this. They help us with everything having to do with this podcast, but they haven't listened yet. And I'm not sure what to think of that. But I'm okay with it, because I just tell my wife about the funny parts. She laughs. I feel good that I did something funny, and then figure she doesn't need to listen to the rest of it.
My wife has listened to a couple. I think she listened to the first 2. I don't think she listened to the last one, because I just did the edits and everything like that by myself and threw it up. But yeah, she's listened to a couple of them. They both laugh at us.
Speaking of who's listening, pleasant surprise. Apparently, we have a German audience.
Yeah.
So, hello in Germany.
Hello.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us.
Proof that Quarantine Dads on Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher has a legitimate global reach.
Yeah.
Who knew?
And from the tech side, what I realized is really you only need to be on Spotify and iTunes, and then all the other smaller ones. Stitcher has their own, right? So we did have to publish there. But all the other ones, like the podcast apps and everything else that people use, basically pull from those 2 feeds. So the nerd talk.
Well, wherever you're listening to us, if you can drop us a review or a rating, that would be fantastic. Helps us know you're listening. Yeah. Helps us know that you're enjoying what you're listening to. And if you have any suggestions or questions, reviews that you want to hear on bourbon or whiskey in particular, info@quarantineddads.com, and we'll take your suggestion into consideration at a board meeting, because we have at least weekly board meetings.
Yeah, it's when we're bored and drinking.
Yeah, I mean, they're production meetings. I mean, we sat down yesterday. No,
Friday night.
Yesterday?
That was Friday night.
Oh, yeah, yesterday was Saturday. Wow. Friday night, and we mapped out reviews all the way to the 4th of July.
Yeah.
And I know you're excited about that.
I am. I'm excited for a number of different things that are coming up around the corner. I know that we went through a few things. I teased in episode 1 that we have a liquor run coming.
Episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. I think you've mentioned it every week.
Yeah.
I think you're excited.
I think I'm excited for that. That is going to keep us, we can't start drinking before that, because we're going to do 4 bottles and 4 tastings. So it'll probably be a little bit of a longer episode, but it's going to be next week. And so that's what we finally figured out.
We're going to do our first liquor run next week. Yeah. And like Micah said, it's going to be 4 bottles. It's going to be themed. So we'll pick either a single producer or a region or a particular type. Like we could do, all rye, or we could do all of some sort of finished, whether it's sherry or something like that.
So there will always be,
but there will always be some sort of theme that ties the 4 bottles together. And then we can kind of compare and contrast, because honestly, that's how this all started, right? This all started because we were sitting around during the winter especially, and we would bring over 2 or 3 bottles, or I'd bring 2, you'd have 2, we'd throw them down, we'd drink through them, we'd talk about them, we'd rank them, we'd have to go back a little bit and sort them out, and we had some great conversation while we were doing it, and we said, I don't know, you have a microphone, why don't we just hit record?
And I mean, it started out where we were talking, and I kind of had jokingly said to my wife, I was like, I'm not having... My wife is very nice. I jokingly said to my wife, I'm not having 1 bottle to taste tonight. We're going to have 4 or 5. It's not binge drinking. It's a flight, 1 glass of each, and we'll move on. But yeah, I'm happy that we kind of figured out a theme and a cadence. We do actually think about, what we're going to do and kind of hopefully... definitely not what we're gonna say.
I walked in your door at 8:05 and hadn't thought about anything, and it's now 8:30.
I know.
We do so much off-air production.
I know we do.
So much.
Actually, this past Friday was the most we've ever done.
It is. So, let's get into it for tonight, and then we can move on to other subjects.
Yes. Widow Jane, and I'm so excited. I got to take a mini tangent before I open the bottle. It's a Widow Jane tangent. We almost did the Widow Jane bourbon. And if we had done it, we would have actually beaten Distiller's review of their Widow Jane 10-year bourbon by like 3 days.
But we didn't
do it. And I haven't seen this reviewed anywhere that I'm looking, at least.
That'd be nice.
And so I am super, super excited to do Widow Jane whiskey distilled from a rye mash, oak and apple wood aged. And it is a 91 proof, which is 45.5% alcohol by volume.
And if you don't know anything about Widow Jane is actually based out of the Red Hook neighborhood in Brooklyn, which shocked the living hell out of me when I first found them several years ago. And this was actually Widow Jane. My dad turned me onto it, surprisingly. Like, he was talking about it because one of his buddies had told him about it, and they were talking about it being hard to get, and I was thinking, okay, is my dad just talking something up, and then I had it for the first time, and I was like, okay, this is good, and it's from New York? Yeah. Kind of caught me off guard.
And I know that I've had quite a few of my colleagues and friends and coworkers, and even had people sitting at a bar, and they realize when I'm talking to like a bartender when I'm traveling or something that I kind of know what I'm talking about when it comes to bourbons and whiskeys, and have recommended the Widow Jane bourbon to a ton of people. I've recommended Widow Jane rye to quite a few people as well, but I have never actually had the Applewood aged Widow Jane rye until about 8:05.
when you just had a little sip.
I had a little sip of it. So when you finish that, by the way, the little Easter egg of production, since we've been talking about it, is us going through and, hey, what does this actually smell like? Hey, what does this actually taste like? To get a preview of it. So what do you think?
It's just, it's apple. I mean, it's apple. It's applewood, right? It's open applewood, and you and I talked beforehand. It's just kind of apple. Yep. I mean, that's what you get on the nose. It's like 3 different types of apples all baked together with a touch of oak. That's more or less what I get.
Yep. And then obviously the spiciness of the rye, right? So let's have this sip.
I said something last week about throwing away the first sip. And I'm going to push back on you a little bit because I was listening back to it. It was the first episode I listened back to, and I went, you know what? I actually don't like to throw away the first sip. And I do from a flavor standpoint and a taste standpoint. From an experience standpoint, I feel like it gives me a lot of information about how something might drink or what I should be prepared for. So I'm willingly throwing away the taste. But not the other.
Well, yeah, because your taste is muted, and that's kind of what I mean by the throwing away that first sip. It's going back to, hey, let's throw away this first sip because you're not gonna get the flavor flowing over the palate because all it is burning your tongue from that standpoint.
But it's got a warm finish. It's got that spicy rye finish on it as I take sip 2. Yep. The apple stays with it. On the front of the palate, especially, just kind of sits there.
I do get a little orange So
there's some orange in it as it drinks through, but on the front of the palate, I think there's a little tartness of an apple.
Yeah,
as well.
I mean, from a spectrum of the apples, right? Like on the nose, I get like a fresh apple, or I do a lot of cooking, grilling, and smoking, and so like when I'm smoking apple wood, like you can when you first like start lighting the actual apple wood, and if you're doing fresh apple wood chunks, not chip stuff.
What was the smoke that you had on the pork last night?
The pork last night.
We had dinner together last night, and the night before, and on Friday. Yeah. But last night.
So what we did was, or what I did was, I have a green egg. Love my green egg. It's worth what you pay for it, especially if you use it as much as I do. The cool part about that was I use their hardwood charcoal, but I always mix in fresh wood. And so last night was oak, like 2 oak logs, smaller size oak logs, and then like 3 bigger chunks of apple wood. So, and I always like to get the actual fresh wood started first. And so from that smell of what you get, where you kind of have the char of the oak barrel and everything else, smells like when I'm hitting and I'm lighting up those apple wood chunks in the grill or in the green egg when I'm getting it started. So you get fresh, like that's kind of like almost like fresh oak wood / apple wood, more on the apple wood side. But you do get a fresh apple on the front. You get a spice note, so it's like a nice spiced warm apple, almost apple pie-ish, right? And as you kind of sit there and like you let it sit on your tongue and in your palate, It's really good.
Yeah, I like it, and it's not. I wouldn't say it. It's definitely not something that's aged a significant amount.
No, and ryes aren't, right?
No, ryes typically aren't. But I think you can tell that, but it's not in an offensive way. You can just tell it's on the younger side.
I mean, we looked it up. We do research.
That's a loose term.
We
use that term loosely.
We use that term very loosely.
I Googled something at 8:10.
Yep. We searched for it. We did see that they use staves, and for those of you that actually don't know what a stave is, because I actually had to tell
No, so hang on a second. So a couple
Explain
of things.
It to him.
One is that there are many, many things, and I'm not the only person in this world. There are many things that I think I know what they are, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. And there are also many people that we all have at least a few, who, when it comes to those things, we go, I would rather ask and have them tell me and go, that's what I thought it was, than assume and be wrong because I'm intimidated by their intelligence. And when it comes to technical things or food things, I am in the camp of I am asking you before assuming I know, because otherwise I just kind of want to put my tail between my legs and go back home. I want to find my cardigan, whatever chair it's on in your home, it's behind me at the moment. Cardigan number 4.
Cardigan number.
Episode 4, cardigan number 4.
That was the
This was the stress buy.
That was the weighted blanket purchase to comfort and soothe him.
Yeah, this was what I talked about last week during episode 3. My wife bought this to soothe me and make me feel better because she knew I was going to continue to need cardigans, but that I needed a lighter one to wear over t-shirts as opposed to my thick winter ones.
It's got a good stripe.
It's got a good stripe, but the other thing I love about it
it's got that top
is
roll.
They put an extra button toward the top that has a loop closure instead of your regular button
That's
closure.
Almost like
so you can kind of turn it into a more like how you would have it with a zip up if you had a zip up sweater.
A zip up, or I almost like picture it with that top button on a trench coat where you've got the little lapel coming over and then you're flipping it over and you button the top one.
Yeah, very excited about this. I've worn it 3 days in a row.
I'm aware.
I wore it with a collared shirt to the office on Friday. Mm-hmm. I wore it yesterday over a t-shirt, and today I have it on over a different t-shirt. Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to wearing it shirtless underneath it. I think that day's coming, I'm sure.
All right, well, on that note...
I actually... There's something about Widow Jane as a distillery that I want to get to. So, one of the reasons we picked this bottle is because we both enjoy their
bourbon so much.
It's a distillery in Brooklyn, which I just think is cool.
Which, when you told me that, it's still... And it actually baffles other people that have a good palate for bourbon and everything else. You're like, that came from Brooklyn.
Yeah. The interesting thing to me, though, is doing some reading about the distillery and learning more about their operations, because I was really thinking, if you're based in Brooklyn, you're obviously not sourcing things in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. So they pull all their what's really their trademark, if you will, is it about 100 miles or
literally
an hour
their
or so?
Their trademark and their name comes from the Widow Jane mine.
Yeah.
Which is obviously closed now. About 100 miles north, and...
It's limestone water.
It's limestone water, which is what Kentucky's so well known for.
Well, and and the reason that's interesting to me whenever I hear limestone is because Minnesota's been known for a lot of limestone, especially when you get into the southeast of Minnesota. Yeah. I mean, all over Minnesota. But when I think limestone, I think southeastern Minnesota, because my parents grew up in two towns along the river that had a lot of limestone bluffs.
And then you actually go west of that, and you get pipestone, which is red in color. Mm-hmm. It's actually pretty cool. The town is actually called Pipestone. There's a lot of... obviously Native American tribes and everything like that have tribal traditions around Pipestone. I'm taking a tangent, but I think it's a really cool one. So I've seen a lot of really cool old Native American peyote pipes and everything like that, and it looks red. It's like a bright red, but it's actually made out of pipestone, and so that'd be kind of a cool thing if somebody started a distillery down there, because I think it has very much the same properties as limestone. But limestone... one of the biggest things, and actually if you go into distillation, one of the things that you need to pull all of it out, otherwise you really can't distill with it. Obviously chemicals, chlorine, all that other stuff. Limestone is Earth's natural filter for filtering out that, and most importantly calcium, as well as iron. And so calcium and iron, you really can't distill with it. It comes out in the flavor. You have to pull all of that out. And there's a lot that goes into actually the science of the water that you put in to your mash, into your wort, to make a spirit. So limestone filtered water really doesn't require any additional processing because it's already so clean and so pure.
And that's what Widow Jane uses, is that limestone water as part of their process. And their bourbons that are 10-year and 12-year, they actually source... if I'm understanding correctly, they source straight bourbons from, I think the 3 states were Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana. And they source them no more than 5 barrels at a time, so they can
I think from the blend standpoint, they're doing no more than 5 barrels in a bowl, and they're blended.
But then they're blending it, and then they're proofing it with that limestone water. And it will be interesting, I was saying to you before we were starting and we were chatting and realized we should probably hit record for the conversation, it'll be interesting to see if Widow Jane changes over time as they age their own in New York, and either add that if they continue to blend, or when they produce a straight bourbon, that's just what they processed in New York because of climate and other properties.
Now, having heard this the second time around, it kind of sparked my mindset, because obviously, really good brand, really good product, all up. And this rye, by the way, this Applewood rye is delicious.
I like it. It's a pleasant...
not overly spicy.
I think it's not overly spicy as a rye, and I think it's just a pleasant drinking experience. It's not... Yeah. I will say I don't find it incredibly complex. No. I think that's the Applewood. I like the recognition of so much apple, but at the same time, I don't know that there's a lot coming behind that, except for notes that just kind of bounce off the apple a little bit. Cinnamon somewhat. Yeah. You said orange. Those bounce in and out, but really it's the apple and in the oak, and that's
and what really minimally on the oak. It's very, very light on the oak. We have to go back to Staves because we tangented a little too far. When you said that again on the apple side, I was like,
but I want to full circle again.
Yeah, we'll just keep going in circles. I'm going in circles.
So Staves, Applewood Staves.
But I want to figure. I think that we'll finally see their specific bourbon come out in a single barrel. So when you start seeing the single barrel of Widow Jane, I would imagine that's when that's their full production, right?
Right.
They've learned enough with the blending and everything else that we'll see a single barrel, or we'll say an original one, or they'll change the name of it.
Well, and that's the I know we're going to get to Staves, but that's the challenge with distilling, because you and I've talked about that as just kind of as a passion project and idea of trying to start something, the two of us. And the challenge with that is that you can make your vodkas and your gins
right out of the gate.
And you can produce them, you can market them, and ideally you hit and you can sell those, and that's what funds other things, at least in our minds. But if your passion is the aged spirits, you have to make a choice about how you're going to do it, because some places may not want to do vodkas and gins. They might just want to be aged spirits. But at that point, like Widow Jane, that seems to me kind of would be a story you'd hear about. Is they're sourcing from other places, they're finding something that gives them an identity, and then they're taking the time to develop their own, whether it's a 3 or 4 year old rye. But once it gets to their 10 or 12 year old bourbons, they're gonna just have to produce it, let it sit, and wait. And that's a challenge of how do you still fund your operations and continue production, even though you're legitimately waiting a decade to take anything to market.
Well, yeah, and I mean, rye, 2 to 4 years, right, at a minimum. I mean, you see most bourbons starting to come out, and we'll talk about it in future episodes, but like Jim Beam's only 2 years. That's a 2-year age, and that's a really, really, and that's that are just plain Jane, pun intended, plain Jane regular bourbon. That's like a 2-year age.
Right.
And for a lot of the higher qualities, I mean, you go into Buffalo Traces and everything like that, and we start talking about their plain bottles. I don't know what Buffalo Trace is from a single year standpoint. I want to say it's right around that 3 or 4. That wouldn't surprise me. But again, you're waiting 4 years. But for the good quality or those higher priced bottles, the higher, better collection stuff, yeah, it's 10 years, 8 years.
But also Beam and Buffalo Trace have been around, 100 plus years, where something like Widow Jane, they're emerging in a market not known for bourbon, and they have to figure out something that allows them to produce high quality while figuring out their own process and quality.
How do you make money as an organization within those first few years? And that's why we see a lot of distilleries in the Midwest start with those vodkas and gins and everything else, and get to the point where they're producing that, and they have a decent product, they're making decent revenue that they can barrel and wait for that aging time. The interesting concept there is actually the Orphaned Barrel collection, because Orphaned Barrel does the same thing. Orphaned Barrel doesn't really produce. They go and acquire barrels from distilleries or from barrel houses that distilleries have gone out of business because they had to wait too long and they couldn't be profitable. And so that's where and by the way, the Orphan Barrel collection is super cool. You can find some really cool, 26-year-old Rhetoric, I believe is a 24 or a 26-year-old Orphan Barrel one.
Did you have Rhetoric?
We have Rhetoric. Yeah,
I've had it with you.
Yes, you've had it.
Yeah,
it's a super old bourbon that is just somebody made a great product, but they went out of business, right? And all of a sudden, they buy these lots of barrels in auctions or from a barrel house owner or what have you, and they test it, they validate it that it's good, and they barrel it and ship it off.
And it's one of the distilleries in Minnesota that I've been thinking about this weekend and doing some of that planning and thinking about what in Minnesota have I had or haven't had. And frankly, it's so easy to drink bourbons and whiskeys from outside of Minnesota that it's easy to forget that Minnesota's got, just from memory, I wrote down about a dozen, and I know there's more than that if I were to pull up a map and really search. And I've had a few. I haven't had a lot, but one of the ones I'm really interested in trying is Rock Filter, and it's out of that southeastern Minnesota. I was on their website today reading about it, and it's interesting that I was reading about it this morning and then jumped on Widow Jane because they talk about the limestone.
Rock Filter. Limestone filtering water.
Yep.
Yeah. Novel,
and really interested to try that. And I know that Ace Spirits that we've talked about has it because I went online and looked. So I'm guessing next time I'm there, I'll probably pick that up to be able to try it. But it'd also be a nice little road trip because it's about, I went to school down in Iowa, just south of that part of the Minnesota border. So that's a nice drive. That'd be a nice little road trip to go down and visit a distillery in that part of the state.
Not, it's like a 2 hour.
No,
right?
It's an hour and a half, hour 40.
So
Staves.
Yeah. So Staves.
I'm pretty sure you brought up Staves at about the 9-minute mark.
Yeah. And now we're back to Staves. So basically think of it as a honeycomb filter or infusion, right? Where you're adding additional wood, and the reason I say honeycomb is you want to make it as porous as possible to basically allow the wood to impact and impart as much flavor as possible into a spirit. I do vodka infusions, and one I do is Stoli Doli. I know you've had it pretty good. You just do pineapple basically in a bucket with a bunch of vodka. You let it sit for a set number of days, and I do 9 days on mine. And then you strain it off and run it through some cheesecloth to get all the little chunks and everything else like that. And you definitely throw the pineapple away because it's inedible. But the cool thing with that is then you're adding just a ton of flavor into that, and it's cut up and chunked up. And to me, that's kind of how I see a stave, right? Is you're putting chunks of a different type of barrel, a different type of wood into that oak barrel to impart as much flavor as possible to really jumpstart the flavor profile.
And you're not necessarily doing that right away, right? You may be adding staves in later in the process.
Some people do. Some people will put it in. There are some distilleries that will right out of the gate will put additional like apple chunks or sherry chunks or staves in there. Sometimes it's chips. Sometimes it's the long, basically looks like kind of like a 2x4 with a bunch of holes drilled into it. But they'll put them in there, and they're kind of suspended because you don't want them just sitting on the bottom. They kind of try and suspend them in the barrel. But the cool thing is I mean, they do wood chips and everything like that. There was a couple of distilleries that we've done that have tried to use ultrasonic cleaners and really what is staves or apple or wood chunks, and essentially what is white lightning or moonshine to ultrasonically force the alcohol in and out very rapidly with sound into the chips and out of the chips, into the chips and out of the chips. You don't get rid of what is called the green flavor, and I know we've talked about this outside of the podcast, but it's going to come up now for obvious reasons as I'm talking about it. But the nature of the forcing it in and out really will give you a lot of color, will give you a lot of the wood flavor. The greenness really fades with time, and really can only fade with time from everything that I've read and seen.
But you can use some of those things to try to intensify
the flavor,
the way it pulls in flavors, and to an extent, quote unquote, ages. I mean, that's the idea, right? Is to try to manufacture the aging process to speed things up. But some of that is only just going to be done with time, like you said. And I think there's actually, I don't remember where they are. I know you and I have talked about them before, and then I haven't gone back to find them. But there are a few places that I think completely have tried to scientifically manufacture the aging process.
That's the one.
Period. End of story.
The ultrasonic cleaners was one of the ones that I actually, we have a bottle of it. You can still taste the greenness. If you've ever had moonshine or had white lightning, they're called a bunch of other things. You know, Buffalo Trace calls it their White Dog Mash. We've used White Dog Mash #1 to age our own bourbon. As a starter, since it's illegal to distill in the state of Minnesota without
licensing. You can put somebody else's distillate in a barrel. You just can't distill your own at home. Let's be clear about that.
Absolutely. So we did our own aging. It was actually a really cool experiment. And Andy actually had some this weekend, which is another story.
We're going to skip that story.
We're going to skip that story. The cool thing with that is, like, it takes time to really trim that off or kind of curb that flavor profile off. But you get a lot of the yeast on the front end and a lot more of whatever grain you used in the flavor. So that really fades with time, and everything that I've read, everything that I've experienced and tasted and everything else is that really only fades with time.
And that's the specific distillery I'm thinking of when I read the most in depth about that scientific aging process actually was aging in concrete. So they were taking the wood completely out of it, which to me felt like cheating. You know, using wood and trying to do some things scientifically to intensify flavor or profile or introduce certain things into it is one thing. But man, it felt just wrong to take wood completely out of the aging process.
You could never,
and that's not a criticism, because I think it's also fascinating to try to manufacture a process that's as delicate as aging into a scientific process instead. I think that's fascinating.
And it is. And ultimately, you could never call it a bourbon or a true rye, right? When you take that out of it. I've seen other things. I talked about ultrasonics. I've seen atmospheric pressure cooking, and basically, essentially trying to force from an atmospheric pressure level into the barrels and then release it. Trying to basically get that breathing back and forth, in and out of that barrel. And that's really the seasons in all of these regions. As it gets hot, basically the pores open up in the oak or open up in the wood, and it sucks in the alcohol. When it gets cold, they contract, and you're pushing it out. So the seasons and the changing of the climate is that breathing in and breathing out of the wood itself, and that's what brings color, that's what brings flavors, that's where you get the oak, that's where you get the apple. So it only makes sense as we tie up like what a stave is. If you're putting staves in, or you're putting additional chips in for flavoring, and from a profile standpoint, you're adding more surface area for the alcohol to breathe into and breathe out of. And then ultimately that's going to impart more flavor, and it's going to do it quicker. The scientific parts of it, of ultrasonic, the concrete side, that's just a little too weird for me. From a scientific standpoint, I could see ultrasonic, I could see like atmospheric and pressure-wise.
But there's just something about aged spirits where it's like, part of aged spirits is the weight and the labor and the history and the aura of it, not just we're going to produce this thing.
Yeah. Well, that gets back to the documentaries, right? Like, and if you haven't, I know it's something that I've been meaning to talk about since about episode 1. But if you haven't seen Neat,
watch it.
Watch it. It is.
Do it now.
Do it now. Well, after the podcast, or do it now.
I mean, you could pause and watch that and come back. It's entirely up to you. We believe in free will.
We do. So from like the Neat standpoint, which is actually really neat, pun. It's been a long week. I think we said that already too.
I'm so tired.
I know.
I'm so tired. What'd you do to me?
Nothing.
Dude, you shot yourself in the neck with a tranquilizer. I'm so tired.
The documentary of Neat was just so good from how to taste. The whole... When you smell whiskey or you smell it, you're supposed to put the cup on your upper lip right underneath your nose. You're actually supposed to keep your mouth open. The reason you keep your mouth open is so that the ethanol, and then the vapor actually goes out your mouth and doesn't go down into your lungs, and it doesn't kind of overwhelm your palate. The whole concept around like the first one's going to kind of burn a little bit and a lot of that stuff really just builds into that whole conversation. And there's so many interesting nuggets in there around how long it takes to see a distiller and a true master distiller when they finally hit the age where they're master distilling. They're probably around our age or hitting into the 40s. And you'll make your first true batch as what you want to do, your recipe, your bill of materials and everything like that. And it takes 15, 20 years for you to see something fully realized and fully mature. And once you've learned enough about that, and even at a 15-year standpoint, so if you took it to 15 years and you started when you're 40, you're going to start your true second batch at 55 years of age and wait another 15 years. And realistically, at another 15 years, you're going to be 70 years old, which means at 70 years old, you're starting your third. Think of it as almost a painting, right? Because it is an art. You're starting your third painting or your third full bill. By the time you see that fully matured, your third masterpiece, your final masterpiece.
Have you seen Man on Fire? Denzel Washington.
Yes.
Yeah. That anytime anyone says masterpiece, I'm sorry. Tangent.
Such a good movie.
Christopher Walken going, his masterpiece is death.
Yeah.
Or his art is death, and he's about to paint his masterpiece.
That was such a good movie for so many reasons.
Now,
and the 9 Inch Nails song was in it.
Denzel should have won an Oscar for Man on Fire.
You should have won an Oscar.
He won it, I believe it was the year after, for Training Day. And you will never convince me otherwise that the reason he won it for Training Day was half career achievement and half because he should have won it for Man on Fire. because the performance he has in Man on Fire was phenomenal.
So good.
And I love Training Day, but Man on Fire was something else.
It was
and
fire.
If you haven't seen that movie, or if you... No, it wasn't... It was just so... It was so...
emotional, deep, and
yeah, like, it was just so complex and raw.
It was... Well, it was the nature of it, and I love that movie as well. So I think in a future weekend, we should watch that together. The thing that really grabbed me with that was it was a man that was broken both in spirit and career and motivation, really had nothing left. And then he finds a light, so to speak, in him actually doing, protecting this little girl who ultimately gets kidnapped. And then when he finds himself, and then all of a sudden he just goes off. And it's like an amazing prequel to, or it's an original John Wick vigilante kind of thing, right? If you liked John Wick, you'll love Man on Fire, because he just basically goes...
Yeah, only Man on Fire actually has a story.
That's true.
That's nothing against John Wick,
no,
but John Wick is awesome for different reasons.
Yes.
Man on Fire is just a damn good movie, and the performance that he gives is that, yeah, exactly like you're saying. He transitions
so much. Yeah.
He transitions so much, and the character arc is so in depth, and he does it so well. Where Training Day, I feel like everyone was like, "Oh, Denzel played this awesome villain, and we're not used to him seeing him play the villain." And it's like, yeah, and it was awesome in its own right, but it didn't have the arc. It just happened to be starkly different than how people were used to absorbing him as an actor versus the performance of it. And yeah, so I think Man on Fire he should have won the Oscar for. Yeah. That's just my opinion.
I think Man on Fire was an amazing movie, and ultimately, my favorite scene in that whole thing was the grenade.
I'm trying to remember.
It was the grenade, or it was the C4, or it was something.
Oh, yeah.
And if you haven't seen it, when you see that scene, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about and be like, that's messed up.
It was also one of those movies that made me fall in love with Christopher Walken. Not that you need a reason to fall in love with Christopher Walken, but it's just so... Like, the character that Walken plays is this... If I remember right, because I haven't seen it in years, but he's this, like... He's the guy who's known him for a lot of his life in terms of his bodyguard work and his military service and his other stuff.
It's a true mentor, right? His true lifelong mentor and friend.
It's more of a friend than a mentor, but you could have had 8,000 actors play that role and it would have just been this nondescript number two, but the fact that you cast Walken for it makes that character memorable. That's the only reason to me that character is memorable from that movie.
There are so many movies that you can say Christopher Walken made that movie. That movie was meh, but the simple fact that he was in it.
I mean, the man's Bruce Dickinson.
Yeah. The Rundown with The Rock and Sean William Scott and Christopher Walken. Christopher Walken is the gold miner, dude, and just the ridiculousness that he is. It was so good. And the movie outside of Christopher Walken is
Well,
but it's funny. It's,
but let's even talk more recent. It's a comedy. Wedding Crashers.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you could have. Who else could have played that role? No. You could have had plenty of people play that role because all you needed was an elder statesman that could do a little comedy. I mean, you could have had Harrison Ford play that role, and he could have been funny enough for the role. But Walken just gives it a life of its own.
He's definitely typecast to the T, because it's if I want this role, I want Walken.
What's he got to be so morose about?
I'm trying to remember the old movie. And
Good Todd! You tell that mean ocean!
I'm trying to remember the kids' movie. It's definitely a 90s movie where they've got the house, and it's Mousetrap, I think it was called. But it has Christopher Walken in it, and he's the exterminator. And it was beyond hilarious.
We will have to... I know that's what you speak.
Yeah. It's a Disney movie for sure. Well, I'm going to have to find it. No, it's not Parent Trapped. Force feeding me gummy bears over here.
I put up with the stories of otters and scallops.
Oh my god, he's so good.
I think it's time for the nightcap.
I think
we don't necessarily need to be done yet, but the nightcap, we named it last week. The nightcap is when we get to done with tasting, that Micah brings out a drink,
a craft cocktail
that he's chosen to use. Well, tonight it's the Widow Jane rye, oak, and applewood aged. He's chosen to use whatever we're tasting in it. So before we get to rating this bottle, what's in the nightcap?
So I was originally going to go with, to be honest, I was going to go with a version of a mint julep because I thought it'd be really cool to do a good rye, and I thought Widow Jane would be really good. I opened this bottle, took 2 sips, and I'm like, I can't put this in a julep. It's got too much apple in it. And then my mind immediately went to, I was like, maybe we'll do Boilermakers. And for those of you that don't know what a Boilermaker is, if you're going to do it, you can do it with basically a beer, or I would have done hard cider, and you take a shot of spirits and you just drop it in there, so you're getting a beer with a shot. There's Mexican ones where you'll take the Corona and you'll do.
That would have been very college of you.
It would have been very college of me. You're the one that yesterday wanted to do shots at 2:00 in the afternoon.
Quiet. It was a long week, and I take no responsibility for anything I suggested yesterday. But go on in what is in this drink, if you would.
So I decided to make some quick mulled cider.
Yeah, I just decided to whip up some mulled cider.
So apple cider.
The spirit moved me, so I made some mulled cider.
The spirit moved me. I made mulled cider. I love when we do bourbon during the winter in mulled cider. I figured why not a rye, especially a rye that has so much orange so much apple, hints of orange. Mulled cider traditionally actually has orange in it at very minimum a peel or an actual piece of orange. So I did about a half orange in each of ours, apple cider, a little bit of nutmeg, a little bit of cinnamon, warmed it up.
It smells amazing.
and there's definitely, it's quite full in the glass, so we're going to take a sip of it before we put some rye into it.
I mean, this is so good without the rye in it. So while you're putting the rye in, I'm going to start the rating off here. I really like this rye. That said, compared to some of the scores we've given out in the first 3 weeks, I don't rate it as highly. And that's not necessarily a knock on the product. It's more a comment on something I said about midway through, is that I just don't find it complex. I find it really enjoyable. I'd buy it again. I'd keep it in the house. Not a problem whatsoever. But from a complexity standpoint, it's apples, some cinnamon and orange bounces in and out, and there's some oak.
Yeah.
That's about what there is. So when I look at it, we have to come up with a joint rating. I would go 7.9.
I was going to do 7.2.
Wow. We can cut the midpoint on that. Hang on. What is the midpoint? The maths are not strong.
That would be 7.55.
So 7.6.
7.55. Yeah, so we're on 7.6.
And I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I am too.
I think 7.6 is...
Sometimes I think when I get a little tired, I get a little bit of, pessimism slips in, and I tend to rate things a little lower. But
I think about it like...
That needs to be stirred.
So I have... All I have is a pen.
I'm going to do it with my finger.
I'm not going to use your pen to stir this. I have... at some point, we should probably talk about ratings generally, not in terms of rating systems, but how we think about numbers. Because I have this problem on Goodreads when I rate books. 5 stars is phenomenal. I would recommend it to anyone. The book I just finished on Thursday night, I gave a 5-star review. But 5 stars is I would go back and read it again. I'd recommend it to anyone. 4 stars is, I really enjoyed it. I'd recommend it. Certainly if it's in the genre that people find interesting. If I thought it fit a certain person, I'd give it to them or recommend it, right? No. But it's not that, recommend everyone. Not saying I'd keep it on the shelf forever and maybe return to it. But the biggest problem on Goodreads is between 3 and 4 stars. Because they don't give you half stars. And 3 stars, if you liked it enough, but you're not, running out to recommend it to a friend, 3 stars doesn't seem sufficient. So you get in this. So I get in this problem area every now and again where I'm like, look, someone wrote a book
Yeah.
They put themselves out there and wrote a book. It had a good story. It was pleasant enough to read. Was it super memorable? Not necessarily, but it feels like it was better than a 3-star. Because 3-star seems like the courtesy 3-star review where I'm not going to say it was terrible, but I'm not willing to say I'd recommend this to anyone. Mm-hmm. And there's that one, that's the one level. And that's, why I'm saying that is because that's kind of where I start in the 7s for any of our reviews. Is if it's above a 7, it is completely inoffensive, enjoyable enough to drink.
Yep.
It's about complexities. It's about preferences. It's about flavor profiles. It's about...
I'm going to be completely honest. This is an extremely hard bottle to find.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt that many of the people that I'm listening to, many of my people have ever heard that this bottle exists, let alone seen it on the shelves. I saw it one day, picked it up. It has been sitting in my pantry for a year plus.
The funny thing is I know where this bottle is right now. I know where we could go tomorrow and get this bottle.
But it's a hard bottle to find.
No, I know.
I think that's why I went lower on it. For the complexity, it's not an overly expensive bottle. I don't remember what I paid for it. I think
it's high 50s, low 60s.
Yeah, I wanted to say that it was about 55. I'm going to look right now.
We have 2 locals. That one is just down the road from us, basically in the town we live in, and then another one is we've mentioned before is Ace Spirits. It's about 15 minutes away. So Dolce Vita is not in far from us in Chaska,
right across from the world-renowned Chaska Curling Center.
Yeah, it's actually the Chaska Curling Club, and that's no joke. The U.S. Olympic curling team uses
current
that
gold
as their
medal winners actually use that
as their training. So that's right down the road from us. What I found is bottles like this, when they show up, particularly at Dolce Vita, because Ace has this renowned shipping. Like, people know about Ace, even though it's small and a one-off. People know about Ace. People don't know about Dolce Vita. I'm not going to say their selection is the level of Aces that's got, 8 bookshelves full of bourbon.
So from a whiskey they don't, but from a wine they do.
Right. Dolce Vita's wine selection.
And they ship, and they do a ton of stuff, because I've actually ordered stuff from Dolce Vita from the Vino.
Right.
And they were like, we'll not charge you shipping charges if you come pick it up. And I was like, wait, you're the one that's down the road?
Yeah. Like they are a one-off, locally owned wine shop owned by people who are really passionate about wine, and they have phenomenal bottles of wine. Their liquor selection is good. It's just not the volume of maybe a store that focuses more on spirits. But the reason I say that is because then when they get bottles like this in, it doesn't move off the shelf as much. Because the people who are going in there don't seem to be looking for this as much as the things they know.
Right.
The Willet Rye that we did in episode 1.
They had 5-6 bottles.
They had 5-6 bottles of it. There was a part of me that just wanted to take them all and cellar them. Yeah. I didn't want to drop the $350 to do it, but
well, especially when they're not moving and flying off the shelves like that. When you're like, there's probably a pretty good chance that there's probably a bottle or two still.
And I'm almost positive that this bottle is on their shelf right now.
Interesting. That may be a
tomorrow trip.
Maybe a trip. Yeah.
Maybe one of the weekly supply runs.
The supply runs.
Or either the grocery store or the liquor store, depending on how the week's going.
Or both.
Yeah, or what my wife asks me to go get.
My wife almost actually, today, she was like, I'm just going to swing in and grab 2 things. I'm like, no, it's not worth the risk of you going in to grab 2 or 3 things. Yeah, we stocked up for the week.
It's like we go when we need something.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so 7.6.
Yep.
Great bottle.
Big ups to Brooklyn.
Big ups to Brooklyn.
37-year-old white guys can say that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
We can definitely say that. That just reminded me of the Bert comment from the stand-up we were watching earlier this week. Oh no, if you bought the album, you can definitely say it.
Oh God. Bert Kreischer and Tom Segura. Yeah, heavy rotation lately.
Heavy rotation. Because we all needed laughs and levity. I really like this bottle. I really like Widow Jane. We love the bourbon. At any given time, So I've always had this policy, and it tends to be kind of waning a little bit in these trying times, but I pride myself to collect, but I also really like to sample, as you know, and and I know I've told you this, but for the listeners and the people, when I do a tasting, I try not to go past the top of the label itself, and then I'll shelve it and I'll buy another one. If I really like it, I'll buy another one and then I'll continue drinking. It gives me a really good spectrum, a really good variety for what I have, and I have a bunch of bottles, as we talked about last episode, that are open, and it's become even more and more increasing because I haven't been traveling, that we have bottles that I just haven't opened yet, but we're saving them for the show as well. So that's
and bottles
exciting.
Can change over time.
They can.
So if you enjoy something, there's no reason to finish off that bottle if you feel like it's a bottle you're going to have, you want to have in the house again, because bottles can change over time.
Yeah,
so it's nice to be able to progressively revisit at different stages. So I think with that, episode 4 in the books.
Episode 4 in the books.
Thanks for listening. QuarantinedDads.com. You can find us on Instagram at Dad's Quarantine. You can find us on Twitter at Dad's Quarantine. You can also email us info@quarantinedads.com if you're interested in connecting with us. And then iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, subscribe, download, rate us. Please rate us. And if you're interested enough to rate us, write a quick review so we know what you think of it, because we'd love to know who's listening, and we'd love to know a little bit more about what people think of the show.
And recommendations of what you want to hear. I mean, I know we have it mapped out for a little bit, but we're always willing to edit and throw a different bottle or two in here or there.
Yeah.
And I would say, definitely click the subscribe. We're really interested in comments. Interestingly enough, we got a couple comments on episode 3 on YouTube, because we post there as well.
Mike is insisting that I appear on video, but I'm not ready for that yet. My beard and my cardigan game aren't quite video ready yet. But with that, we're going to enjoy our mulled cider and Widow Jane rye from Oak and Applewood. Mm-hmm. So again, at Dad's Quarantine on Instagram and Twitter, and find us on wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. That's all I have. Micah, you got anything?
Don't go outside. There are bears out there. And cheers.
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 Cheers.